India's textbooks have become a political battlefield. From Mughal history to Maulana Azad, the excisions are now triggering a nationwide debate. I'm Barkha Dutt, you're with the Mojo. Sections of Mughal history have been excised from India's textbooks, creating a furor, predictable debates, and a highly politicized conversation. Is there a way to step back from the politics of it all? Remember, every day brings a new headline. The latest is the excision of a reference to Maulana Azad, India's first education minister. And there are many contentious references that have been removed in what the NCERT is calling a syllabus rationalization. But as I said, is there a way to step back from the noise of the politics, from the noise of the polarizations, and actually have an objective empirical conversation on what is at stake here? Also, is there a way to be empirical about history? Depending on whose lens you're looking at history through, you may end up with a very different picture. Well, we could try and put some of these very complex questions to one of the country's best known historian authors, Manu Pillai. Manu had a very compelling article out in the Times of India where he actually looked at the relationship between violence, power, and royalty. Let's go across now to Manu, who joins us on the program today. Good to see you as always, Manu. Read your piece with great interest. And the argument that you seem to be making, for the benefit of our audience who may have missed it, is that if the Mughals were violent, if the Mughals brutalized, sort of in their policies or in some of their policies, it isn't because they were uniquely violent. It isn't certainly because they were Mughals, but it is because they displayed the arrogance that was associated with wielding that scale of power. And you give other examples of other royalties that in some cases that believed in mutilation of enemies, for instance. So when you look at this raging debate around Mughal history and the sections that have been excised, what's the one big argument that you'd like to make?
I think it's simply that, we seem to be, the accusation is that history is skewed one way. And evidently, the attempt now is to correct it in quotes. But what seems to be happening is that you're skewing it in a completely different direction. Even if you look at some of the social media chatter that's been going around, just today I read a comment on Instagram where somebody was saying, it's precisely because history has been skewed that now there's a reaction and this is a backlash. And if you put up with skewed history, then you must put up with the backlash also. But that doesn't really solve the problem, right? If you're saying that there's a problem, then the problem is to find something that's reasonable, find something that's sensible, not to skew it this way first and then skew it that way the next, when there's a different set of people in charge or a different set of people who are actually handling this. So I think in general, we need to just calm down a little bit. A lot of uninformed opinions are going around. For example, the simple fact that people all the time say that our textbooks in history were only full of the Mughals. There's nothing else in our textbooks. It's become one of those statements that people just make without any kind of real evidence or memory even. Most people who make these statements haven't studied history beyond class 10. Class 10, they abandoned it. So their only experience has been textbooks, which is probably years and years ago. It's like one of those statements people make on Nehru, right? That Nehru was a bad prime minister. Now, it's not because they know he was bad. It's not because they've sat down and analyzed his policies. It's just one of those things that people say. And that's something that's happening here also, where there's this general belief that Mughals, by which a lot of people mean Muslims, have occupied too much space in Indian history books. And we must somehow correct this and give equal representation or more space to Hindu heroes. That's ultimately boils down to that. The Mughals are in some ways also proxy for Muslims. And the idea is we need Hindu heroes in a time where there's also Hindu nationalism and a general climate of Hindu resurgence.
Now, you speak about Hindu kings, as it were, the Wadiyars of Mysore. You speak about the Arthashastra, where violence was an accepted, legitimate response by the state, by the royals to opponents. You speak about mutilating the faces of enemies in the case of the Mysore rulers. You speak about assassination of your opponents being considered legitimate for kings, as chronicled in the Arthashastra. And you give these examples, I think, to make the point that sure, there could be Mughal kings who were guilty of excesses of state brutality, but there were kings of all religions who were guilty of the same.
I think violence was intrinsically linked to kingship as an institution. It doesn't matter which part of the world we're looking at. It doesn't matter what religion we're looking at. European history is just as gory and violent. Indian history is gory and violent across the board. It has nothing to do with, it's not as if the Mughals came and everybody here was just living in peace as a non-violent nation and somehow the Mughals injected a lot of violence into the country. The Arthashastra precedes the Mughals by many, many, many centuries. It talks, as you were referring to, very violent means for the king to retain his power and control. So violence was intrinsically linked to kingship because kings needed not only to hold on to their power, which by the way was a very fickle substance back in the day. There was no guarantee you would have it. You could be toppled by a relative, you could be toppled by a courtier. You had to come up with all kinds of strategies to legitimize yourself and hold on to power, which is why anytime that power was threatened, not only was there violence, but the violence was often exemplary. It was often extremely public. It was often extremely gory to drive the message into people's minds that if you stand up to the ruling authority, there will be very, very severe consequences. So the consequences include, such as Veluthambi Dalava in the early 19th century in Kerala, a guy who tried to organize a mutiny against him in the Travancore state army had his legs tied to different elephants, and the elephants sort of moved in opposite directions, tearing him very slowly into two pieces. You have similar examples, I think, in the Arthashastra of people being torn apart by bullocks. It talks about being cooked in a jar. That's another option the Arthashastra provides. Heads are cut off and impaled and put out in public. Krishnadevaraya, for example, kills Yusuf Adil Shah of Bijapur and impales, puts his head on a stake, and it's displayed prominently. When there's an assassination attempt against Devaraya II of Vijayanagara, he gets that man's head cut off and, according to one account, gets on a horse and trots up and down his capital, holding that head in his hand to make a statement to his people that I am still in charge, I am still in control, and the person who tried to topple me is dead, and this is the fate that he's met. So whether you're talking about Hindu kings or Muslim kings, violence is a given. The brutality of the Mughals, particularly targeted against Hindu Rajas, affects a lot of people. There is, of course, a lot to unpack there. Similarly, the brutality of Aurangzeb against the Sikhs, that's another sore point.
That was in fact going to be my question. That there are those who say that all right, maybe all kingdoms, the rulers, as it were, quote unquote, were guilty of violence. And I think you have a great line in your piece, where you say the archive is stained with blood. But the criticism of the Mughals in particular is, by those who are cheering on the sort of reduction of the space they're getting in history books, is that they targeted other faiths. Aurangzeb with the Sikhs, as you mentioned, the jizya taxes invoked again and again as an example. And that is what distinguished them from the generic violence, as it were, of those who governed, of those who were sort of ruled, so to speak. How do you respond to that?
Well, to begin with, one shouldn't get into this game of whataboutery, but even so, to begin with, it wasn't just the Mughals that targeted people in the name of religion. In Mysore, I think it was Chikadevaraja of Mysore, who basically targets the Lingayats or targets the Veerashaivas. Now, again, what's interesting here is that Veerashaivism, which was its own kind of identity at that time, did not believe in temples, did not believe in idols, and so on. That becomes, peasants belong to that particular community in certain parts, and using religious leaders of that particular sect, they manage to orchestrate a rebellion. So rebellion, which is political, which is economic, gets a certain kind of legitimizing force through religion, and the Mysore Vadiyar, who's a Hindu Raja, comes down very forcefully against them. He summons, the story goes, it's 400 spiritual leaders of the Veerashaivas, ostensibly for a peace meeting, and once they're there, he sort of cuts their throats, or they're beheaded or strangulated or whatever it is that happens, and one by one they're killed. Now, if you look at the same thing in Aurangzeb and the Sikhs to him were a political problem. Sikhism allowed the Sikhs to have a kind of united identity. It allowed them to articulate and legitimize their resistance against the Mughals. And Aurangzeb would also have fallen back on religious ideology to justify his action against the Sikhs. But again, you can see it's a mix of religion, it's a mix of economics, it's a mix of political motives, etc. Now, these are stark cases, but in general, even if you're looking at the Mughals, you find that different emperors believed in these things to different degrees. And again, now if you take somebody like Aurangzeb calling Chhatrapati Shivaji an infidel and a mountain rat and so on, and saying that I'm going to destroy this infidel, the people who he sends to destroy the so-called, in quotes, infidel are Rajputs. Now, that means Rajputs are welcome in his court. They're also Hindus. They're definitely allowed in his court. They have a certain amount of status and prestige in their court. In later periods, in fact, in the early 19th century, when the British arrived in Rajputana after defeating the Marathas in 1803, 1804, the Rajputs actually welcomed the British because they were so tired of Maratha overlordship that they were happy to serve the British rather than the Marathas. So a lot of these labels that we use now relatively casually, that is, oh, the Mughals targeted all Hindus, that didn't necessarily exist in that form back in the day to start with. The other thing is, it wasn't some kind of uniform, sustained ideology of the state. It was something that, if and when needed, emperors could sort of trot out and say, "We're fighting in the name of religion, and we're going to destroy this temple, or we're going to destroy this and this, such and such a king." But other emperors might choose to do something else and end up marrying from those communities. And remember also that emperors passing orders in pre-modern India didn't mean it translated to actual action on the ground all the time. There's a case from Orissa where Aurangzeb ordered that Jagannath of Orissa, I think, the main idol be destroyed. His own Mughal governor in the region destroyed some fake idol and said that the task is done while maintaining the temple, simply because the pilgrim economy and the money and revenue coming in from Jagannath was too high, and the local Mughal authorities were very reluctant to part with that kind of income. So there's several layers and complications to any kind of simplistic argument. Again, my point is not that we must somehow glorify certain emperors and play down others, or we must not look at the so-called negative side of things. We must certainly engage with it, but we must engage with it with sobriety, not with emotion, because ultimately history as a discipline is the question is, are we here to create some emotional narrative which to justify an ideology or to justify a movement or to justify a particular moment in our country? Or are we here to genuinely study history dispassionately? And that dispassionate means that you have to study all aspects of it equally: the violence, the good, the bad, the ugly, all of it.
To be fair, we are not the only country where history is deeply politicized, and in a very volatile conversation in the United States of America, the Confederate statues have been flashpoints for contemporary politics and have been taken down across the U.S. In the United Kingdom, there's a complete whitewashing and erasure, as it were, of the empire and its cruelty. And here we are, now in this very politicized moment, but the argument could be made that the interpretation of history can never be strictly empirical, can never be strictly fact based. It's always going to be emotional, because what you see depends on whose lens you look at it through. Given that, how do we tackle very emotional subjects, for example, that come up repeatedly in today's politics, like the destruction of temples?
I think there are certain ground rules you follow, right? As you said, history is about arguments, it's about counter arguments, and it's also about who makes the more compelling argument. Now, you and I can sit and quibble over certain facts and certain episodes in Indian history, but the question is, whose argument is more convincing, whose argument has more evidence, whose argument actually stands up to scrutiny. I think that makes all the difference. Now, I'll give you one example. I think in the 60s, there was this incident where Gaurakshaks came and hit out Parliament. And this was Indira Gandhi when she was in power. And eventually there was police action. They actually plundered the minister Kamaraj's house and so on. And at some point, police came and they shot people. And the official count is 6 people died, I think, 6 or 8 or some very small number like that. But today there are websites that have emotionalized this to say that 50,000 Hindus were killed in that particular action by Mrs. Gandhi. And there are unmarked graves somewhere where she's gone and buried all these people. Now, this retelling of that episode, where we have evidence of what actually transpired, but an emotional side of it, that itself can be analyzed, because the emotional side is meant to rouse people. It's meant to create a sense of persecution. It's meant to suggest that we are victims and we need to stand up and fight. Now, history is full of narratives like this. Sometimes different caste communities remember the same historical figures in different ways. You'll have, so one example I give is Marthandavarma of Travancore in Kerala. In the kingly narrative, he's this very pious soul who's been ordered by God to go out and conquer kingdoms and serve the deity. And yet in marginalized communities like the Nadars of Kanyakumari district, who have these oral songs, the Villipata, in these Villipatas, he's shown as a very cunning, treacherous king who sort of wins always by crook rather than in a noble way. That's just two sides or two memories of the same king. Now, as a historian, when you're analyzing it, your job is not to take sides and say, okay, I think this is the pious Marthandavarma is the one I like, and I'm going to ignore the other side. Your job is to look at both these sides and say, look, to understand and gain a fuller picture, this is the evidence we have, and we look at both sides and say, what is this evidence trying to communicate to us? So the pious side in Sanskrit, in a Sanskrit place, trying to communicate the king's formal narrative. The Villupata is trying to communicate what people at the bottom of society, people at the receiving end of some of his more cruel policies, what they are trying to communicate. Both will end up having exaggerations, by the way. It's not like one is correct or more correct than the other. Both can end up having exaggerations, but we have to then dispassionately sit and analyze all of them with an equal and a sort of reasonable measure, and try and get on board all of the evidence that can be culled from this. So it is emotional. There is going to be counter arguments, but there are ground rules by which we approach these arguments. Right now, what seems to be happening is there's an emotional need to villainize the Mughals, and one knows why, because of the wider politics in the country and so on. There is, as I said earlier, need for Hindu heroes, a desire to construct a Hindu narrative of history without Muslim influence. And as part of that, we sometimes tend to lose all sense of balance and fall into one side or one trap rather than looking at it in a reasonable fashion.
My other question is, how far back do you travel in history when you're trying to, let's say, correct an injustice of the past? One of the things that disturbs me today is that effectively, when we keep slotting the Mughals as outsiders, as conquerors, and we say this to Muslims today, you're effectively trying to say to Indian Muslims that you should somehow account for what happened X number of, sort of years ago, eons ago, literally. How do you tackle this insider outsider question?
I think it's silly to start with because, yes, Babur came here as an invader. You can perhaps argue that the first two generations of Mughals were definitely outsiders, but they never left the country after that. Even though they emotionally had this need to conquer their ancestral place, and they did mount a few campaigns to conquer back a territory they'd lost in their hometown. Babur came from Fargana, for example. That was more a prestige thing. It was more a case of not that they wanted to pack their bags and go back from India back to wherever they came from, but it was a prestige thing that this is where we came from. Therefore, we must make an attempt to gain it back. But this is where we've set down our roots, and this is where we are staying. The other thing is this using of the Mughals as a proxy for Indian Muslims assumes somehow that the Indian Muslim identity is a monolith that is wedded at the hip to the Mughals. Firstly, the Malayali Muslims who've been around, if legend is to be believed, from the time of the Prophet Muhammad himself, but definitely from inscriptional evidence, by the 9th century, they were in Kerala. Islam was in Kerala. They had nothing to do with the Mughals. They were here long before the Mughals came. If you're talking about South Indian Muslims, why aren't we talking about the Deccan Sultanates? They were actually enemies of the Mughals. So it's not as if Muslim kings all got along and came together in some kind of club to tyrannize and terrorize Hindus. They had their own internal issues. They had their own internal dissonances. Muslim identity itself is diverse. You look at architecture, right? A mosque in Kashmir doesn't look like a mosque in Calicut. Islam in Bhopal is not the same as Islam in Malabar. There's lots of internal changes and dissonances and cultural peculiarities to Islam itself in the Indian subcontinent. And to somehow reduce that to the Mughals and make contemporary Muslims answer for it is silly. By the same yardstick, then we, like someone like me, an upper caste Indian man, would have to answer for the things my ancestors did to Dalits, right? But is that how the world is going to be built in the 21st century? We can be aware of it, certainly. We must talk about it. We must read about it. We must be aware of it. We must not hide the violence, certainly. But I don't think this is about correcting mistakes of the past in the present. You can't change the past. You can't correct anything in the past. You can only make the present better and perhaps learn from history.
Well, I don't know about that. And why are we pulling down Confederate statues? Why are the Enid Blytons being excised from the Gollywog character? Why is
Terrible,
Roald Dahl
terrible.
being... Yeah,
I'm not on board with statues being pulled down in general. Partly also because if you start doing, if you allow that to happen in another part of the world, and someone decides to import that formula into India, you'll find that a lot of monuments, people will want the Taj Mahal to be pulled down next. It's not
yeah.
beyond the realm of possibility now. There will be people who say such things.
Yeah, that's the point. That once you kind of go down that rabbit hole, there is no end, and there has to be even caps on political correctness. Right now this is a conversation being driven by the right wing in India, but equally there is a sort of left wing in other countries, and including our own, which would argue for a degree of political correctness that would look to sanitize, all context out of When Enid Blyton used a reference, she did not look at it as racist. So I don't know. It's a very complicated conversation.
No, I think we must have the maturity to recognize that all of these books also belong to certain contexts and times. Even
yeah,
a book that I wrote in 2015, I wrote that when I was 25. I'm 33 now. I'm a different person, right? So it's
yeah.
not as if I can go back in time and somehow change that book. I wouldn't even do that because that book is also a measure of of the context it represents. The context in it was in which it was written, and what the author was at that particular juncture. So I think we need to have a degree of maturity when dealing with these things, instead of somehow, as you said, getting into this Olympics of political correctness.
Here's my question in the end. This hasn't begun and stopped with Mughal history and the debate around it. We are now seeing, references to Gandhi's work for Hindu-Muslim amity, one sentence taken out there. We're seeing a sentence that refers to Maulana Azad, India's first education minister, at the Constituent Assembly meetings being removed. The NCERT has encountered it. We're now seeing reports that a reference to Darwin and evolution is not there. So this has gone well beyond the debate around Mughal history. This has gone well beyond, Aurangzeb was a cruel Mughal. What concerns you the most about what's happening today?
I think it's just the loss of faith in these textbooks, right? Because at some point or the other, people are just going to realize textbooks are just another political shuttlecock. And they've always been, by the way. It's not as if
Yeah.
earlier governments were somehow innocent. All governments ultimately try to use any state-controlled literature to promote their narratives. It might be what they think of as a constructive narrative. It could be a so-called destructive narrative. But the point is, they want control precisely to seed certain ideas about who we are and what the nation is, etc. in textbooks. But what's unfortunate is that instead of improving our textbooks truly, none of these people are genuinely interested in history, as far as I can tell. All the politicians commenting on this, all the governments that are meddling with the history textbooks, they're not interested in history. They're interested in the textbooks. That's all their priority is, and that, I think, is really tragic. If we have an opportunity, it is to truly reimagine textbooks, be creative, understand complexity, take a single historical character, single historical figure, look at this person from all sides, and understand simply the complexity of every human being, especially human beings in power. That would enrich kids a lot more than trying to excise Babur out of the textbook, remove Maulana Azad, remove Darwin, and so on. It's just silly and it's frankly juvenile. A whole generation of kids will grow up, much poorer for it than in our time. It wasn't like textbooks were great, but even so, I think they'll go from bad to worse in future, unfortunately.
Yeah. I mean, the bottom line is, if you care that much about history, read, and no one wants to do that. Everyone just wants to talk. I would urge people who are really interested in the subject to please not just listen to this conversation with Manu Pillai, but also read his excellent article in the Times of India. Manu, thank you. Always a pleasure. Take care, and thanks for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
We started Mojo right here in this basement. Just 4 people. And now we're about to hit our first 1 million subscribers. So this is to say thank you to all of you for your support, for your respect, and for your encouragement. We've always gone to where the story is. During the pandemic, when television's big anchors were hunkered down in their studios or at their homes, we hit the road. We traveled from Delhi to Kerala, covering 30,000 kilometers in a small car, reporting from inside ICUs and inside slum tenements. Whether it's flash floods or war zones, we've always put our boots on the ground. In fact, we're just back from Punjab, tailing the Khalistani fugitive Amritpal Singh. And through all of this, we have always put you, the people, first. In an age of partisan polarized media where most journalists are either chamcha ya morcha, we believe the story is sacred and the truth of the story is what matters. And now, as we get ready for the next step, we need your help. Become a Mojo member and get first access to all our big interviews. Get a chance to ask our newsmakers questions. Get a chance to write and report for us for both our website and our channels. And also, interact with me and my colleagues directly through AMA sessions. Literally, ask me anything. Click on the join now right next to the subscribe button, and yes, also subscribe if you haven't yet, and become a Mojo member for just 159 rupees a month. Hope to see lots of you in our community.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.